Welcome to Abolition Lessons here on the Schools Not Prisons podcast. Remember, there's no need to take an assigned seat. There will be no tests, no grades, and definitely no detention. All you need is an open mind. Founded in 2016, Schools Not Prisons is part of a larger movement to examine the history of the prison industrial complex and how oppression in all its forms has worked to criminalize young Black and brown people across the United States. I'm your host, Irene Franco Rubio, and this is the Schools Not Prisons podcast. Before we get into today's interview, let's go over some vocabulary so we can really understand the story our guest is about to share with us. Our key terms and concepts to consider today are patriarchy, a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded. A quote to better understand patriarchy is from The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love. Bell Hooks writes, "The first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves." In this episode of Abolition Lessons, we explore abolitionist futures by learning how to embrace and practice community-based masculinity. Challenging the patriarchy and settler colonialism in our everyday lives helps us understand how we can change it. Richie Reseda is a music, film, and content producer who was freed from prison in 2018. He co-created and co-hosted the Spotify original podcast Abolition X. While in prison, he started Question Culture, the independent media collective that houses his projects, and co-founded Success Stories, the feminist program for incarcerated men chronicled in the CNN documentary The Feminist on Cell Block Y. Yeah, so can you share with us a little bit about yourself, how you identify as, and a little bit about the work that you do?
Yeah, I'm Richie. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a producer, and I practice transformative justice in my everyday life and relationships. I run a worker-owned media collective that I started in prison called Question Culture. We do management, production, and creative direction.
How did you get to this point of, one, I say consciousness broadly, but how did you get to this point of understanding the systems in which you were existing in, and how that played a role in the work that you wanted to do, in this case as Question Culture started to arise as a space that you were trying to build new ways of thinking in community and relationship? How did this even emerge?
When I was 14 and failing out of school for real, I met my political mentors, Mark Anthony Johnson and Patrisse Cullors initially, and then I met a whole generation of political mentors and their political mentors, and they were bringing me to feminist men's groups, which is where I discovered Bell Hooks. I discovered is such a colonial thing to say. She was there for a long time before I got there.
You encountered.
I became aware of her work and was deeply influenced by it and saw myself in her writing We Real Cool, principally, and then A Will to Change, and then like kept going from there. So I was really blessed to have good political mentorship, feminist political mentorship, Black and brown women of color, non-binary people of color around me as a kid and I believe those ways of being, like feminine ways of being, non-binary ways of being, queer ways of being, are also closer to the truth and harder to colonize. So anywho, those people, my best friend Haywan, who I met at that time, she was 16, I was 14. Those people were huge in like introducing me to or familiarizing me with, deepening my understanding and deepening my practice of more connected ways of being. Because I think like, yes, it's political, but ultimately like politics isn't the goal. Like connection is the goal.
Right.
To live like, like plants live. And by that I mean like plants are actually multi-celled beings that are all working together. They can do better together than alone. Right. If all the plant cells went on their own, they would die. But like together, well, they wouldn't die. They were like that first. But they started forming plants because it actually helps them survive.
Right.
And we lived like that too for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah. I wanted to touch a little bit more on when this emerged in your life, sort of as a young person now encountered or engaging in sort of just experiences with the police.
I think also just to give background,
Yeah.
that LA has the biggest school police department in the world, the Los Angeles School Police Department, which is an independent police department. That is not the Los Angeles Police Department or the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. It is another one.
Damn.
And they have armed officers on kindergarten through 12th grade campuses all over LA. So that was the context in which I grew up. And it was also the zero tolerance days. It was like the post-Columbine shooting days that happened when I was in second grade, which was like the first big school shooting.
And I guess just to stop you there quickly, the zero tolerance policies, could you briefly define it? I feel like I have a general sense, but could you briefly explain what that was?
Yeah, it was the idea that in order to keep schools safe, you need to prosecute children to the fullest extent of the law, as opposed to having it dealing with it in like a school rules situation. No, this is a legal situation.
Right. Yeah.
It comes from the broken windows theory of policing under Chief William Bratton. He didn't make it up. A quote-unquote criminologist made it up, but he applied it as the chief of police in Los Angeles in the 90s, which was this idea that like if a kid throws a rock at a window, like it's only so long before he breaks into that window and steals something. So you should punish him as if he already did it.
Right.
That was the theory of safety, which was like just be extremely violent and you'll scare people out of, doing harm. Children specifically. So I just grew up in very policed schools. But it started when I was 4. I wasn't in LAUSD yet, the Los Angeles Unified School District. I was at a preschool where my mom worked, and they brought in a police to talk about how you shouldn't talk to strangers. And then he left, and he came back with like he had like a tissue on his head and some sunglasses, like acting like it was a disguise. And then he asked me if I wanted to get candy.
Yeah.
And I was like, sure, because I knew who he was. But then he came back and like tried to embarrass me in front of everybody. Like, look at this kid. He talks to strangers and like tried to embarrass me and my mom. And I was just like, oh, I can't trust you.
Yeah.
Like, you're not actually here to support me. You're trying to make me look dumb. And it kind of continued that way. I was, like I said, I was kicked out of school when I was 8 years old. And the first time I got detained and handcuffed, I was 11 for playing too rough. I got arrested when I was 13 for leaving school early. I got arrested again for vandalism, quote unquote, when I was 13. I got chokeslammed by the school police department when I was 15 for talking during an assembly. Like I just continuously had negative, right? And then the first time I got like arrested for real, like charged, court, was for possession for sales when I was 16. And then I got arrested again when I was 17, I was 18, then when I was 19, and then when I was 19, they tried to give me 150 years to life for robbery, and I ended up getting 10 years and going to prison. Right,
damn. Well, one, I'm sorry that the system, failed you, but then also very intentionally did what it was supposed to do in a lot of ways. And I'm sure that, like, during your time, whether incarcerated and even upon release, like, you've really seen it all in different facets, right? I think one is like how settler colonialism persists, which is something that you've been getting at, and how that shows up in our daily lives. So even you leaving, there's still those sort of remnants of like what happened there and how it continues to like play a role in your life and all of our lives. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely. And how we play a role in it. Like it's not separate than us.
Yeah.
It is the physical manifestation of what we kind of all believe. Like, and how we move on a day-to-day basis. The speed with which we move necessitates the police.
Yeah.
You know? Like, if we're not making sure that we actually have consensus amongst people, then, okay, if I could just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, please.
Because I feel like it's important that people understand that, like, the police are not separate than us. They're not like this evil thing that's just oppressing us, and we're like, oh my God, stop. We're not saying stop. We're telling them go. You know,
We're encouraging
in the way that we move. So like the way that we're taught, and of course it's because we've been taught a certain way of being that we just see as normal.
Yeah.
That we're all individuals who are only responsible for ourselves. We're not necessarily accountable to anybody. We're not even taught to be accountable to ourselves. Like if I say I'm going to do something and I don't say it to anybody else, and I just don't do it, it's like, well, I didn't say it's only to me. Like, who cares, you know? So we don't have a culture of accountability, and therefore it necessitates a culture of policing.
Yeah.
Like, you're either it's like a scale.
Yeah.
You're either more accountable and policing less, or you're more policing and less accountable.
Yeah.
And by that I mean, like, what is keeping us safe in this room right now? It's not the police.
Yeah.
It's like there is at least a baseline understanding of accountability, in that, like, you want to be here, I want to be here. You want to do a podcast, I agree to being on a podcast. We talked ahead of time of, like, under what conditions we would both be down to do that, right? Nobody's, like, forcing us to be here.
Right.
But if we didn't want to be here, if we didn't want to do a podcast, then somebody would have to force us with threat of violence. You see what I'm saying?
I see what you're getting at.
And so since we don't have a culture of accountability, of, like, true consensus, we assume, and because we're in a situation of scarcity and everybody being for themselves in a competitive situation, we're naturally set up all against each other, which then, like, capitalism then requires there to be some kind of referee that can do a bunch of violence to, like, quote unquote, keep you in line.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I can just say one more thing about it, I guess, because I hope that's clear.
No, it definitely is. And I feel like you're really laying out the groundwork for what sort of embracing a world of accountability could look like.
Yeah.
And I feel like people have a hard time trying to understand what it is.
Yeah. It's hard because we don't have it and we don't see it. Like, it's like trying to explain to a fish what water is, you know? Because at this point in the game, if we were to just get rid of the police and get rid of prisons, what would likely happen, and, like, get rid of borders and get rid of the government and get rid of all these things that do violence, what would likely happen is we would have a bunch of, like, violent militias and, like, that would control different areas through force, because we still understand all of our needs to be at odds with one another.
Yeah.
Like, I can't eat if you eat. You can't eat if I eat. I need to hoard resources and have as much as possible to make sure I'm safe, and that means you're asked out, right? Those are the conditions in which we grew up and think.
Yeah.
So if we're not transforming that way of thinking, we'll always have some new form of violence, especially those of us who come from traumatized backgrounds, right?
And just going off of that, I feel like one facet that really perpetuates that is a notion of masculinity, or in this case, of patriarchy, and how that persists in just the ways that we naturally think that we're thinking, but really is not us naturally. How does the notion of masculinity, or in this case, moving towards an abolitionist masculinity, sort of start to occur, knowing that this is the sort of world that we're trying to get to? How can people start to, one, I guess in this case, how did you start to understand masculinity in your life, and how did you start to challenge it?
I'm going to say one thing, and then I'm going to answer a question directly. I feel like I described what we have, and I want to describe what else is possible, and, like, what was actually possible, how people lived before colonization.
Yeah.
So a connected masculinity, or a community-based masculinity, is a masculinity that's based in that idea that we all have the same needs and that we need each other to meet those needs. And I discovered that by first performing a lot of, quote, patriarchy, a lot of disconnected masculinity, while also being in community with my political community that we're trying to build something else and move in more connected ways. And then being in prison, reading bell hooks, being in those communities, and being like, and having a space to, like, really try to practice connected masculinity with other incarcerated men. And it is through the act of, like, practicing it and trying new things, and being vulnerable, which is a big part of, you can't be connected without being vulnerable, you know? That's why it's so comfortable to be in our disconnected masculinity, or whatever disconnected performance. Whether you're performing femininity or masculinity, you can do it in a connected way or a disconnected way, right? But speaking about masculinity, because I feel like, though I am a fairly feminine person, I do feel like I identify with a lot of masculinity. And I just had to practice and try a lot of stuff to build a more connected way of being with other incarcerated people, because I saw the pain of disconnection. I had to live through incarceration, which is like I was saying, like that is a product of disconnection. That's what lets capitalism run so fast. Everything's perfect. Everything's fine. That person's in a way. Get them out of here. If somebody's wigging out, having a mental health crisis in front of any of these little Hollywood streets, what people gonna do? Call the police. Get them out of here. They're interrupting the flow. We don't have time for their needs. You know, like, that's what I mean when I'm like, we need the like this way of being requires the police. Yeah. People be like, I don't want the police, but it's like, do you know your neighbors? Yeah. Do you actually move in connected ways with your community, or are you just doing you every day, moving really fast? Because if you're doing that, the police are actually helping you do that. They're keeping the quote unquote riffraff out your way. You know, they're. It doesn't matter if it's fair. The justice system doesn't need to be fair. It just needs to be good at disappearing people who are in the way. So anyway, it was through experiencing the pain of being in the way of capitalism and being dealt with as such.
And I really appreciate how you're laying it out as like, there is a current system in which, in this case, capitalism requires it to be a streamlined, very like, how can we flow this most efficiently? I think the way in which you described it of like, a lot of us are complicit in that nature of like, we want things to be efficient. We want things to be quick. We want to like get to work on time. We want to do this, we want to do that. And it's like, in those ways, we're perpetuating it, right? How did you start to grapple with that resistance and encouraging people to move towards a sort of liberated thinking in the way that you did?
Modeling it. We gotta be something that we talk about in Success Stories program, which is the organization that I'm talking about, where we're doing feminist accountability work in prison and still do, is what we learned. We started out trying to teach. Let me teach you about bell hooks. Let me have like a book club vibe, and it wasn't really hitting. But when I practice vulnerability, I invite people to be vulnerable. And yeah, at first it was like scary as fuck. Like I was reading bell hooks, and then I would be afraid to talk to people about it. Like I thought they were gonna hit me or something. And then I realized over time that they weren't, and and then eventually they were. And I actually got fine with that. Like a person might try to hit me, and I have had people try to fight me over doing this work. But I got okay with it once I stopped taking that personal and understanding like, this is this person's body responding to the medicine. Yeah. You know? Yeah. But they gonna be all right. Yeah. And I'm gonna be all right.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of how the resistance or pushback started to occur?
Yeah. It looks so many ways, but I remember one time I was taking a shower. I was and there was this other OG in a shower. It was like a 4-person shower, but there's only 2 of us in there. And he was telling me this story, and just every time he referred to a woman in the story, he referred to her as the B word. And I just asked him, I was like, yo, OG, can I ask you a question? He was like, sure. And I said, I think I asked him, do you only refer to women as the B word? And this dude walked up on me like he was going to hit me. Mind you, we are in the nude with shower shoes on. And was like, I didn't say it to be corrected. And just like, was just giving aggression. Yeah. And I feel like early in my incarceration, like my biggest fear was like being in like a vulnerable position of a shower and being attacked. But at this level, at that point, I had been doing like masculinity work with myself and other incarcerated men for some time that I was like, this old dude don't want to fight in the shower either. Yeah. He might do it if he feels like his value as a person is being threatened enough. And just knowing like that's what's on the line for people when they're showing up that way. It's like they've been taught and they have learned to understand themselves a certain way. And like that's, you know, I need to be a real man, and being a real man is what gives me value. Yeah. Like as a person, what makes me worthwhile. So I just didn't take it personal, and I kept it within the realm of questions. Yeah. And said, I'm just asking you a question.
Yeah, no, but it's very real. And I think there's a lot to be said about why there was this sort of like, really maybe a sort of anger that emerged, like, in why are you challenging everything that I've been taught about the world? Like, why are you challenging just this one simple thing that may seem simple to him? But I can see why, like, it's ingrained into, like, previous generations' ways of thinking. Like, it's central to who they are, central to the ways in which the society has taught them to think.
The ways that we are living broadly as a society are reliant upon these ideas. So people get angry because we can feel we're like plants in that, like, you put a plant by a window, it's going to grow towards the sun, and its roots are going to go into whatever pot you put it in. if that pot is not a good pot, it's still going to be rooted in that pot. And if you take it out of that pot and put it in another one, it's going to shock the plant, and the plant's going to like, and that's like what we have done with those sacred needs that we have. Yeah. We've rooted them into something toxic. We've rooted them into individualism, and patriarchy is such a key part of how this system runs. Yeah. And so like it's the folks who are oppressed by patriarchy in the most direct way, like feminine people, genderqueer people, like it's like trying to fit. It's like basically stay in your place kind of vibes. Like for all this to work, you need to just be less than, and that's just what it is. Yeah. And people don't even see that. People don't even see it. Like it's like similar to racism. Yeah. And then you have people who love changing the symbols. They love feminist symbols. They love anti-racist symbols. They love to see a woman running a company or a black person on a freaking board of some shit, But when it comes to actually challenging the patriarchal systems, they're not down. Yeah. And that's like, you have conservatives who are like, keep it exactly as it is. Yeah. And then you have liberals, which are like, make it look pretty and different and quote unquote inclusive, but keep it exactly how it is structurally. And that is the challenge that we come up against. And I feel like the challenge for us as masculine people who identify with masculinity is like, how are we practicing our masculinity in a way that is connected with everybody rather than reliant on dominating everybody?
And I think the example you just gave too is in a way what it means to be in a neoliberal world, where it's like change the face but keep the same thinking, keep the same structure. So I just thought that would be like neoliberalism as an idea is the sort of new world that's supposedly progressive, supposedly like cares about you, doesn't really at all.
But not really. Yeah. Look at Palestine. Yeah. Palestine fucks neoliberals up because we're actually like, no, you have to stop colonizing now. Like it's not just about, like, Israel is really good at the neoliberal thing. Like, we love queer people here. Yeah. We have all kinds of, we have women soldiers. Right. Like, it's like very good at like looking like, using the, the woke symbols. But ultimately they are actively colonizing, as is the United States, So yeah, we can see it. That's why that's like the break. That's like where so many organizations, where we lose our funding, where we like, because all the people who think they're down with us, it's like when it's time to stop colonizing for real and change the way we are being, it is way harder.
I really appreciate just like the breakdown here in a lot of ways, things that may seem progressive. And I think in the case of Palestine and Israel is precisely telling of the world we live in. Like it's a contradiction and no one is fully acknowledging that. So I think in order to get to a place of understanding that and kind of bringing us back to the masculinity notion, how do we start to practice that? How do we practice community-based masculinity as a way to sort of challenge the contradictions that we exist in while simultaneously like helping one another?
I think it's by practicing actual accountability, which is not the same as punishment, which is not the same as shame. It's actually the opposite of those things. It's really like accounting, like taking account for who is responsible for what. What am I responsible for? And working that into our performances, practices of masculinity. Like, how do I basically move in such a way that recognizes and suits the needs of everybody around me, as opposed to move in such a way that only suits my needs, maybe at the expense of everybody around me.
And in that way, you, I'm sure, encounter folks that were taught in many ways notions of toxic masculinity, right? And I think one thing we talked about was moving towards this sort of phrase of abolitionist masculinity. How do you go about getting to that point or helping others get to understand that idea? Perhaps for someone who may not know what abolitionist masculinities looks like altogether. And I hope that's kind of clear what I'm trying to get at. Like, for people who can't envision or conceptualize what it means to be, masculine in a way that's beneficial to everybody, but also abolitionist at the same time. How do those ideas exist simultaneously?
I think it's helpful to define abolition. Okay. Abolition is the ending of the colonial system and its culture, and the practice of building something new. And then masculinity is like, it's so hard to define because it's practiced so different in all these different cultures. There's this book that I love called The Prehistory of Sex, which goes into just all these different ways that sexuality and gender were performed by human societies. And that book really helped me because I was like, oh, there's so many ways that people have performed sexuality, gender, built families, built communities over time. The colonial way insisted that it's the only way. That's what makes it colonial. It's like we have to go around and convince everybody of our way so we can have one world system that works really efficiently towards a certain end. So your initial question, sorry, you asked, like, I wanted to just define what it is.
No, it's great. I feel like, one, in your explanation of abolition, you define it as challenging and sort of recreating a new world that does not embody anything relating to the colonial state. And I think there's something to be said there in that it's not just abolishing police or prisons.
Yeah.
It's getting to a world of, like, all settler colonial ideas need to be sort of thrown away, and we can move towards thinking about things in shared community, in shared healing. I think the analogy on the plants is a really key example that you shared already. How do we help others understand that as a way of thinking, though? I think it could be hard in this current world to not think of abolition as just like, oh, it's simply police and it's simply prisons and it's simply incarceration.
Because that wouldn't work. Yeah. We can't have abolition. You can't get rid of police and prisons and still have capitalism.
Right.
Like, because the police and prisons are based on laws, which the whole thing is made up. It's just all made up. So, like, it's you're not actually talking about harm at that point. You're talking about, like, that which is illegal. But most of the harm on the planet is not illegal. Most of the harm on the planet is completely legal. What Israel is doing to Gaza right now is completely legal by their own laws. And there has been no international laws that have stopped them. You know? So it's not illegal. Like, stealing, even the way that our companies are set up, where you work for a company and you don't keep all the money that you made that day, it goes to the owners who didn't even work there. That's completely legal, but it's theft. You know? So the notion that we're going to abolish prisons and police and keep capitalism, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't get rid of the harm. It'll just look different, you know? So with that being said, the only way I can really answer that question is, how do I practice, how do I seek to practice an abolitionist masculinity, a connected masculinity, a community-based masculinity? And what I try to do is just build integrity, meaning aligning my needs with the needs of all the living things around me in every single thing I do, in each of my businesses, in each of my relationships. It's like, never do I try my best to align my needs with the people around me, you know, like the plant cells do. In its most basic form, the easiest answer I can give you is by being in, like, pods, which are like circles of accountability. So I have one, my, like, main pod is with, like, 4 dudes who I was locked up with. And we meet, it's been like once a month. And we talk about 3 key things: relationships, finances, and safety. And it's a space that's not about judgment. It's not about right or wrong, good, bad, punishment. It's not even about advice. I would do it this way. I would do it this way. It's about, like, who do you want to be? And how do we support you, hold you accountable in who you want to be? What is most important to you? What are the relationships and goals, ways of being that are most important to you? And how do we hold you accountable to that month by month? Because this individualist, violent system and just our own humanity will knock us off that square of showing up that way. That is where I practice, like, accountable, connected masculinity. That is how I practice. It's like an active thing. It's not necessarily just like reading books and knowing stuff. The liberals would love it if all we had to do is know stuff.
Right.
But it's not that. You don't need a college degree. You don't need to even read a book for real. It's helpful, but you don't need to. It's like, it is the practice of living in an accountable, connected way as a masculine person every day, and, like, talking openly about, you know, how to do that. Like, I have, like, one pod where we kind of only talk about, like, sex and relationships. And I had hit them up because I'm like, this is going to be very personal, but I feel like that's the only way to really do it, is, like, there is somebody who I had like talked to before. We had like mostly a sexual relationship. And then I had gotten to this like era of my life where I was like, I'm not really trying to be in the streets like that, and had like kind of too many relationships but it was just like I just had too much energy everywhere, and I felt like I couldn't focus on what was most important to me. So I ended the sexual aspect of that relationship. And then as I've like been feeling a little more on my square in terms of what I'm trying to do and who I'm trying to be every day, and like actually desiring more like of those types of relationships in my life, rather than just doing it because I'm me and it's on me and I can just do whatever I want, which is like the capitalist dream. I actually went back to those same friends and hit them up and were like, yo, I'm thinking about re-engaging with this person. But y'all saw that I couldn't really maintain it last time and kind of let it fall by the wayside, would say I was going to pull up, didn't, like just wasn't treating this person that was truly honoring their value. And I'm thinking about re-engaging with them. What do y'all think about that? And they asked me all these questions, like, what do boundaries look like? What does the communication look like? Like, how are you describing what it is you desire? Like, what kind of questions are you asking this person? Like, how are you setting yourself up to actually have an accountable relationship with this person, even if it is like on some fuck buddy shit, you know? Like, how do you do that in an accountable way? And that was really helpful. And I ultimately decided not to move forward with that. But that is an example of, for me, of like trying to live in a connected, accountable way.
Thanks for sharing that. I feel like it's giving us like a very real, like everyday interactions, whether with sort of personal partners and relationships or just like beyond thinking about like the larger society. This is trying to get at like how we engage with friends and partners, and how that in itself is sort of practicing ideas of abolition too. And I think we want to sort of remove those ideas. It's like, oh no, this doesn't exist when it has to do with sex, or this doesn't exist when it has to do with friends. But it's like in every facet of life, we can be sort of preserving ideas, colonial ideas, or we can challenge them.
We need to be in relationship with other people. Like we're either relying on each other or relying on the system.
And how can people go about integrating accountability pods in their own lives? Like, how did you go about it? Did you just reach out to your friends and I was like, hey, I need to be held accountable. I need this as a sort of like another set of eyes or thinkers to help me ideate on just relationships or whatever it may be. How can people start to integrate that into their own lives?
Yes, exactly what you said. I love that you said another set of eyes. That's all accountability is having another set of eyes on something. Literally being intentional with our closest relationships. I think, like circling up regularly to have honest conversations, to hold each other accountable to the people who we say we want to be. It really is that simple. Who are you closest with? Say the honest thing, the real thing. Heal those relationships if you need to. Another big part of this is doing a lot of healing work. I'm on at least 2 to 3 healing calls a day. I don't just jump into relationships anymore. And I don't just mean romantic sexual relationships. I mean friendships and all that. Because it actually is a lot of work to be in an accountable relationship with somebody. Not just I hit you up whenever I want and you answer whenever you want. That's bullshit. That's what we're used to. No shade. I still have hundreds of relationships like that. But like that is why we're in the system that we're in. The situation that we're in, right? But to truly have an integrated relationship where your needs are being centered and my needs are being aligned, takes a lot of work. When we are all on the same page with each other, we don't need them. You know what I'm saying? Like if somebody's wigging out, being violent in the street, and I know their grandma, I'm gonna call their grandma, not the police. Like but in order for me to be able to call your grandma, I got to know your grandma and I got to know you. And I got to know that you actually don't want to show up the way that you're showing up in that moment. So I'm not forcing you. I'm not policing you. I'm not telling you to be what I want you to be. I'm helping you be who you want to be, because you don't want to be in the streets acting reckless either, you know? So healing our relationships and then setting up time, regular time, like monthly time, bi-weekly time to be accountable to each other, support each other in being who we want to be, we are going to be good. And I know this for a fact. This is not a theoretical thing. I do this every day. This is what I spend most of my time doing for real. And this is what we do in prison. In success stories, we don't tell people, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to be this. They're like, bro, fuck you. What the fuck? You're in jail just like me. Who the fuck are you to tell me what to do, you know? But we ask people, who is most important to you? What is most important to you? And then we check in every week. And are you living in a way that's actually in alignment with that? Because that is integrity. Are you living in a way that is aligned with who and what is most important to you? That's all we need to do. We don't need police with guns to tell us, don't hurt people. We don't want to hurt people when our needs are met.
Yeah.
We hurt people because we think we have to meet our needs. And because in many ways, we do have to meet our needs. We do have to. I've had so many people call me in on a regular basis of like, you're not in this area of your life, you're not showing up in the way that you say you are. In order for it to work, we got to release the defensiveness that capitalism teaches us to move with. Because if we could get rid of the defensiveness, now we at least can communicate about real shit and try to be in integrity with each other. But defensiveness and the police go hand in hand.
I guess just to contextualize a bit more about what you were going on, from a personal sort of experiences with accountability to what that looks like with the state, to what that looks like in the country, to what that looks like in genocide. Like, how do you start to put things in a very, larger scale that allows people to understand this has real implications on how we're engaging with these ideas?
I feel like there's so many dope people doing so much different cool work about how to spread this accountable way of being to the overall culture. The way that we do it at Question Culture is by practicing this way of being with artists and then producing their art to spread it to the culture that way. The way that we do it at Success Stories is everybody who goes, we're in like 11 prisons all over the state and different like schools and jails and stuff all over the country. And when people graduate the program, we're now putting them into pods like this with the people they graduated with. The last example I'll give is the Just Transitions framework, which is like a framework that describes how we are in a transitional period now. If we're going to get back to a reciprocal, connected world, from the capitalist, exploitative, individualist world, that it will take generations, just like it took generations to build this world. So where are we in that process, and how do we move in a way? We're actually not trying to get it done all right now, which is heartbreaking, right? As somebody with multiple loved ones in prison right now, it is heartbreaking. People will be like, well, you're not going to convince the Republicans and the cops to live this way. It's like, whoa, why are you starting with the people who are most addicted to capitalism? Are you down to do it?
Right.
If you're down to do it, then over the course, what happens is, like, it's like the bell curve. The people who are most down does it first, and then everybody else catches on.
Yeah.
Let's start with the people closest to us, who are most accountable to. The people who I do it with are formerly incarcerated men, are people of color, are people my age, people from LA, people who I'm like on the same tip. Let's be the thing, you know? And it will spread to everybody else over time, just like this whack-ass culture we have now spread to everybody else over time.
And one sort of last question I'll give you to frame just how we're thinking about community-based masculinity and how that exists today, how you're practicing it. How can we start to move towards a truly abolitionist world?
By getting into pods.
Yeah.
Truly. That is my only message in 2024.
Yeah.
Is like, if you want a new world, practice that shit with your closest relationships right now. Link with them, have the accountable conversations. Like, stop moving as a bunch of individuals with your own individual destiny, your individual family, your individual bank account, do it. Link with your people and say who it is you want to be, what's most important to you, ask them to do the same, and then hold each other accountable to that. When we do that, we don't need police. When we do that, we put our money together. If everybody in this room put our money together right now, everybody stop paying rent and just put our money together, we could go buy something on the corner and have somewhere to live. Like, it really is that simple. When we are together, we don't need them. We don't need that system.
Yeah. Thank you to Richie Reseda for joining us on today's episode of the Schools Not Prisons podcast. Together, we learned what it means to embrace abolition as a way of life in our everyday lives, how to challenge capitalism and colonialism as they persist, and overall integrating accountability pods as shared ways of thinking in community with one another and within our own lives as well. The Schools Not Prisons podcast is produced by Revolve Impact, an award-winning social change creative agency and content studio in partnership with Mordida Studios. This podcast is produced by myself, Irene Franco Rubio, Akishian Wells, Mariela Rosario, and Mike De La Rocha.